Okay, hi everyone, it's SmithyQ from SmithyQ.com, and now we're on to, I believe this is part 3 of the opening survey, where we're going to try to discuss the Sicilian. This will be broken down into 2 parts. This section today is going to be on the open Sicilian, so everything after where white's going to play knight f3, and then no matter what black plays, following up with d4. That's what defines the open Sicilian. And then the next video is going to cover all the anti-Sicilians, which they'll probably both be the same length of videos, in all honesty, because there's so much material to cover on this opening. And in truth, I need to say it right here off the bat, is that it's very hard to talk about the Sicilian in general, because it's so concrete, because it's so particular. There's very few rules of thumb that always apply across all of the Sicilians. There's some, but each variation of Sicilian is so different, depending on what white does, on what black does, is that, again, broad generalities are extremely difficult. So I'm going to try and cover as much material as I can, so let's just jump right in. So the first thing, if we were to look at the Sicilian, even just looking at the first 2 moves, is that this is really defining the entire game right here. Is that white first, he plays e4, and he's going to play d4 to completely dominate the set. Now black, he could play e5. That's one way of stopping white from dominating the center. It's very, very symmetrical, and black's going to be very, very solid. By playing c5, he's still trying to protect the center, right? He's preventing white from immediately putting a pawn there. He's going to take it. But it's also quite different, because c5 does not help development. It might be able to get the queen out, maybe, but that's not really the purpose of it. What black is doing is that he's trying to play asymmetrically. He is not just copying white. He's not playing pure, solid chess, trying to minimize white's advantage. It's the opposite. He's trying to create an unbalanced, asymmetric position. And we can see that quite clearly after this main line. Let's just do 2 more moves just for the sake of it. And so, if we're to look at this, both sides have 2 knights developed, 2 minor pieces. That's excellent. But that's kind of where the similarities end. White's bishops can come out extremely quickly. In one move, basically in 2 more moves, white's going to have all of his minor pieces out. It only takes 1 move to bring the queen. He's going to castle within 2 moves. He can castle in either direction. He's got more space. You can notice how white has pieces up to the 4th rank, whereas black only has his pieces and pawns here on the 3rd rank. Notice how it's going to take much longer for black to bring both of his bishops out. It's going to take at least 2 moves, a pawn move and a bishop move, a pawn move and a bishop move. So that's going to take 4 tempi to just get his minor pieces developed. Whereas, for white, in 4 tempi, he's going to have all of his pieces, he's going to castle, he's going to be ready to attack. So we can see right here, this is white's main advantage. He has more space, and he has time. His pieces are coming out very quickly. But of course, if that was the only one side of the story, if that was it, then everyone would play the Sicilian as white, right? Why would you play it as black? Because black has some advantages as well. First off, black actually has no weaknesses currently, so that's always great. He also has 2 center pawns to white's 1. And we could see that in, if we just imagined a fantasy variation, something like this. We'll just imagine this. Where all of a sudden, after a brief exchange in the center, black is left with only the only pawn in the center, and so black actually has more central control. And in fact, if you look at this position, it's completely changed. Both sides have equal development. Black can get his bishop out very, very quickly. Black can castle. Black actually has more space. It's white who's stuck on only occupies the 3 ranks, whereas black is occupying his entire half the board, and he's even invading in on white's. And so this right here is actually black's real advantage in the Sicilian, is that he has the potential, at least, for greater central control. Again, he has the 2 pawns, white has 1. And so there's this really interesting battle of ideas. White has development, active pieces, whereas black has central control, or the potential for more central control. which is going to even out, which is more important. And that clash is what makes such interesting games. Because it's not as if, we were to back up, it's that Petrov or something, where it's, the pawn structure is the same, we each have a knight in this, everything is going to develop completely normally, let's go to sleep, let's call it a draw right now. It's the exact opposite with the Sicilian. It's two different ideas clashing. And then, further, we can notice that white, his pawn is already in the center, and he's also aiming a little bit more on the king side. And so, we'll often see that, again, if we look at a couple moves here, is that it's really easy for white to continue with f4, e5, and invade further on the center, and potentially on the king side. His pieces can go there very, very quickly. Imagine stuff like this and this. You can see how, his pieces just naturally gravitate towards the king side, or they can very quickly. With black, it's a little bit different. Again, if we look back in the very first move, is yes, he's contested in the center, but he also has extra space on the queen side. And in particular, this open c file is where black gets a lot of counterplay. Or sorry, it will be open. Let's just look at a different line. Something like this. Is that it's very, very common that this file is where black is going to get his play, get some pressure. This is where the tactics usually appear. Often the queen comes to c7 because it's aiming and targeting towards the queen side. The rook has a natural outpost, one of the rooks, on the c file. And we'll see later that there's thematic sacrifices and plans often involve this. But otherwise, black is extremely flexible. And we're going to see that if we were to back up, is that there are really... there's a lot of different variations of the Sicilian, but you can roughly divide them into 3 different families, depending on how black wants to play it. Assuming, again, it's the open Sicilian. Let's just look at this one. And so the 3 families are basically how is black going to deal with the center, and how does he deal with this bishop in particular? And so one example would be what are known as the dragon families, where black is going to fianchetto this bishop. Usually he puts his other pawn on. Let me just do a couple moves. I'll just make some normal moves here. Castle and castle. And so when black fianchettos this bishop, this is generally known as the dragon variations. And this is where black, in these variations, is going for pure optimal piece play. And we can actually see that. All of his pieces are on great squares. Look, this diagonal is completely open. This diagonal is completely open. That's great. The knights, they can dance around. The knights can dance around. If you compare this to the other versions of the Sicilian, often black has one or some pieces, or he's cramped, and it's hard to get all of his pieces extremely active. Whereas here we can see that black is very harmonious. This is the dragon. Let's just discuss the dragon in a bit more detail. So what is black's plan here? Well, black's plan kind of depends on what white does. And this is the other interesting thing about the Sicilian. It's not just, unlike some other openings, we talked about the black lion in the previous video, in which black has this idea he's going to attack on the king side, and there's not a lot white can really do about it. If black wants to attack, he's going to do that. With the Sicilian, it's going to be different. There's a lot more give and take. It's a dance. It takes 2 to tango. Here, we can see that white has castled kingside. He's done absolutely normal development. And so that means the game's going to be a lot more calmer. It's going to be a lot more positional. And it's likely going to revolve around the center. Can black get d5 in? Because again, if black is able to get d5 and exchange pawns, then he's left with the only central pawn. He's going to have potentially more central control over the center. Right? There's also the thematic ideas on the queen side, where we're going to develop this bishop. We can put it to d7, bring a rook over to the c pawn, the c file, where the rook's going to pressure down here. Maybe we get these pawns starting to march, because this is, again, where black generally has his play, because we can kind of see where black wants to go. This bishop is aiming down here, but again, we've got that c file. If these pawns are to march all the way here, maybe the knight jumps in, maybe the queen jumps over, maybe the bishop comes in, we can see how everything naturally wants to go to the queen side. And so Black will often try and combine some of this queenside pressure and maneuvers with trying to get the crucial d5 break in. Because if he can do that, he's generally laughing. Things are great. And what's white doing? Well, white's nice and calm, he's nice and safe, there's no attack on his king, and he tends to play this quite slowly. He'll often play f4, bishop f3, and everything's protected on each other. He can then eventually try and get an e5, usually he'll finish development, and that's quite nice. Alternatively, white can try and simply hold black back. For instance, he can often play with something like a5, trying to get in a4, a5, just stopping black from advancing on the queen side. He would love to be able to put a knight here. For instance, is it white to move? If we ever had this type of pawn... Sorry. Come on. This type of pawn structure, yes, this one. Then we could see how there's a lovely outpost for the knight, or the bishop, or any white piece, in which white is going to be getting some space, and then he's going to slowly ratchet up the pressure. One of the main ideas in this type of position is to successfully get knight d5 in without losing this pawn. So if you just imagine this, where if this pawn wasn't hanging, we're going to get this type of pawn structure. Because now things have changed, okay? The knight's going to move somewhere. Sure, let's take it. Why not? Let's just do mass exchanges. This will actually really illustrate this. Is how this pawn is now on a backwards e-pawn on an open file. And so white is just going to pile everything up on that, and that pawn's going to be extremely weak, and black is simply stuck defending it. And notice how this pawn is preventing it from marching forward. If it tries to march forward, it's going to be taken, and then either there's a new weak pawn there, or there's a new weak pawn on the d-file. So we can see in this particular way, the dragon is more positional in nature. The plans are not trying to kill the other king. It's queenside space, it's central pressure, it's expansion, it's weak pawns. But of course, this isn't the only way to play the dragon. And when most people think the dragon, they actually think of something quite different. It's usually the option, well, yeah, we'll say usually, where white, instead of playing bishop e2 and castling, is going to do the exact opposite. He's going to castle queenside. And this is actually a really easy position to explain. It's pure caveman chess. Both sides are trying to kill each other with a vicious checkmate attack. Sack, sack, mate, as Fischer said. And the plans are very well known, and white is going to throw his pawns at black, try and open lines, and checkmate him, using his rooks and queens. And black is going to do the exact same thing. He's going to throw his pawns at white, or he's going to bring his pieces out at white, and he's going to try and checkmate white. And this bishop is both the best defender and the best attacker that black has. This is why white often wants to exchange this bishop. Though, he's got to time it well. If white tries it too early, where he just tries to exchange lightning fast, this often seems to allow black to get a very fast attack coming back in. Where now this rook is misplaced, the d5 break might be able to come in, and practice has just shown that if white does it too early, it doesn't tend to work very well. Or that is, black's attack is just as fast. And so white wants to exchange the bishop, maybe not exchange it as fast as possible. More importantly is to get the pawns rolling. But at the same time, he has to watch his own king. And so it's a pure race. They're a lot of fun, especially if you win. If we were now to contrast that with the other variations of Sicilian, or the other flavors, if you will, families, is the second one we'll look at is where black, instead of putting the bishop on g6 here, is where he's going to play e6 and eventually put the bishop on e7, either right away or whenever. And at the risk of absolutely butchering this, this is the Scheveningen pawn structure, or the small center. Sometimes it's the hedgehog when it's combined with a6, and it's got a lot of names. But the idea basically is black isn't fianchettoing, and he isn't putting the pawn on e5, at least not right away. This is a very different style of game. Again, we noticed before, when the bishop is on g7, it is a potential beast where it's slicing through absolutely everything. It's a great attacker. Instead, we're going to see on e7, it's much more modest. And black's idea here in this type of structure is generally more as a counterpuncher. That is, he's going to put this wall of pawns. Let me just... no, it's black to move. We'll just do something like this. And so we can see, as a sample, this is just me throwing moves out. Don't pretend this is theory or anything. And I guess there's just a pawn that's just hanging here, right? Doesn't matter. Okay, let's not let the pawn hang. So we look at a position like this, which is fairly typical. We can see in some ways it's similar to the dragon, the first variation we looked at. In a sense that white is nice and compact, he's developed nice and simple, easily, he's got his small central pawns, and in general, white's plans are going to be the same. He's going to try and play e5 or f5, slowly advance in the center or the king side, whichever may work. If you contrast that with black is still sitting behind his pawns, and he's waiting for a good time to either hit back with e5 or d5 or b5, b4, or what have you. He can play stuff like knight c5, where he's really pressuring from afar. And we can actually notice how his pawns are doing a very good job of keeping white's pieces back. This is actually more obvious if we were to look at a different variation of this. This is known as the Sozin-Fischer line, if I know my theory correctly. We'll just look at something like this. In which, again, these pawns are here. But what has happened, again, we can see that white, classic Sicilian, he's castled quickly, he's got lots of pieces developed. Black only has 2, he hasn't castled yet, he's got to be careful. What black is relying on are that his pawns are controlling a lot of key squares. Where can, for example, this knight go? It's not easy to jump forward in any way because all the squares are protected. Same thing for this knight. Where can it go? Where can the bishop go? They actually can't go anywhere freely because black's pawns control everything. And so what black tries to do here is, again, he's trying to use his pawns to limit white's pieces. Then he's going to catch up in development. Then he'll eventually use one of his pawn breaks. He'll play b4 or a4, a5 or d5. He's going to play something and expand. And his position is kind of like a coiled spring. It's really, really compact. It's easy to break if you don't know what you're doing. But at the same time, if you can unleash it at the right point, all that potential energy, it just... black can get surprising activity very, very quickly. But there's also the other side, is that black is making a heck of a lot of pawn moves. And in fact, it's actually possible for him to make too many pawn moves. And it leads to white's main idea, is that if white can destroy this pawn shield, then black is likely simply toast. For instance, imagine there's this sacrifice. Take, queen's attacked, let's move the queen somewhere. Take with check, king has to move, maybe move the knight over here. What's happened? Well, black, he's up a piece, but he's lost 3 pawns, his king's in the center, and that pawn shield that he had, that was designed to keep away white's pieces, is completely gone. White's pieces are able to simply jump in. We can imagine even a5, more sacrifices. And of course, black's king is stuck on the d file, which is wide open. And we can just see how all white's major pieces are able to aim right at him. So this is black's main worry in this type of position, is that he's moving a lot of pawns, so he has to make sure that white's sacrifices are never there, are never possible. Because if white can do a sacrifice for 2 pawns, for 3 pawns, sometimes even just for 1 pawn, but it opens everything up, you're going to wish you developed a lot faster. But it's also possible that white's sacrifice is mistimed, that he miscalculated, and then black is simply up a piece. Right? It's this interesting Sicilian battle, highly interesting. And so again, this kind of shows, again, the couple of different ways that white can approach this type of position. He can, again, he's developing his pieces very aggressively. He's not moving his pawns. He's trying to prepare sacrifices if at all possible. Or, like we saw in the other variation, if I can pick it up, is he can play more slow and controlled, where he's playing behind his pawns as well, and he's going to slowly walk forward, black is slowly walk forward, and it's more positional in nature. And so, in the Sicilian, both sides need to, again, it takes two to tango. It's very difficult to play the Sicilian well if you're gung-ho on one idea only, and you're not paying attention to your opponent. This goes for white, and it goes for black. And again, this is what makes the Sicilian such an interesting opening, and why it's so popular at the master level. And then, so we've looked at the small, where black plays g6. We've looked at where he plays d6 and e6. And so then the last one, frick, chess base. What a great program. Are the variations where black plays with e5. So instead of putting the pawn on e6, he's putting the pawn on e5. This leads to completely different positions, just like the dragon and the Scheveningen are very different from each other. This is very, very different, which is again why calling it the Sicilian as just one opening doesn't really make sense. You know, what type of Sicilian, what flavor, and even among here there are different. There's different varieties of e5 Sicilians. There's different varieties of the Scheveningen. Even the dragons are often quite similar, but there's the accelerator. Doesn't matter. It's quite different. And this is now entering into a different type of... let me just do the main line. So both sides have two knights developed. That's great. Both sides have one pawn in the center. That's great. Only one side has a huge positional weakness, though, and that's black. Is that this square is massively weak. There's no pawn that can fight for control for d5 anymore. d5 is simply it's weak, and it's going to be weak pretty much for the rest of the game. And this basically tells us what White's idea is going to be. White is going to try and fight for this square. He wants to put a piece there. He's got to be careful. Let me actually just back up for a second. Let's just do a different move. Let's do something like this. Right. So the square is weak. All right. Again, this is just a fantasy variation, just to show the idea. Don't take this as theory or anything. White has to be careful, because if he puts his knight in there too quickly, black can take it, and then there's a pawn on the square now. And as long as there's a pawn there, then that means there can never be a piece there. White wants to have a piece. A knight is far better on d5 than a pawn. Right? Okay, yeah, sure, he has a space advantage, but it's not what it could be. And so what White is trying to do, especially in these main lines, is place a piece there. And so that means he wants to get rid of all of black's protection of that square. So that means he wants to trade that knight. He wants to, if possible, get rid of this. Because if black is only left with the dark square bishop, especially here in the main line after d6, we can see how the bishop isn't very happy because it's stuck behind its own pawn. If that's black's only minor piece, and white is able to get a knight onto d5, the knight just lives there, then black is very unhappy. I play this variation sometimes as black, and there are positions where you want to cry because your pieces suck so much, because everything that could have went wrong did go wrong. You lost complete control of this positional, highly important square. You lost the positional battle. But that's not the only thing. Yes, black has a weakness, but he's going to argue that he has dynamic counterplay. And so this is where perhaps the highest form, or the most recent form of chess understanding, if you were to look at this opening and what the theoreticians looked at it in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they just said that white was just better because black has a weakness for absolutely nothing. But the more we understand chess, as chess knowledge has increased, we've begun to appreciate the importance of piece activity, of dynamism, of where you can have a weak square, but if you have active pieces, they can make up for that weakness. And so what black is going to argue is that he's going to get enough activity to make up for that weakness. And if we were to look at the absolute main line, which looks something like this, We're here. Again, as always, white has a choice how he wants to play it. He can play it positionally or he can play it actively. Let's look at the active version, where he takes the knight. Black doesn't want to take with the queen, because then the knight is hitting the queen, and it's hitting c7, and the queen has to come all the way back, so that's not very good. And so he ends up taking with the pawn. We're going to jump in. And so if we're to look at this, again, white, at first glance, he has his knight. Beautiful, awesome, everything he wants. But that's not really the whole story, is it? Because this knight is absolutely amazing, but this knight is currently out of play. And it's the worst knight on the board. And what black is going to do is that he wants to be able to play f5. Exchange these pawns, bring the other pawn out, and all of a sudden he's actually got 3 pawns in the center. He's going to start pushing here. The bishop can come here, it can come here, this bishop can come here. The pawns can start marching. And black is arguing that he has these dynamic possibilities. He could castle, or he could use the g-file. The queen could slide all the way out. This bishop could also go to this diagonal. There are lots of active possibilities that black has. And they're not just active like here short term, but long term. These long term active plans for 10, 15 moves, which white has to fight against. Now he has a great knight, yay, excellent. But is that enough? And this is where the games revolve around, of whether having a very strong piece, whether it's a knight or a bishop or whatever, on d5 is enough to fight off black's activity. Or it's also the counter, is that can black generate enough activity to justify having such a weak knight? Because if black doesn't do anything, if black is just la 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 la, and he's playing quiet normal moves like it's a normal position, well, white's got a positional advantage. White's going to get his pieces active, he's going to stop black, and then black is just worse. And so this leads to some extremely interesting games. So, that is the Sicilian. Now you might have noticed that I've just spent almost half an hour talking about the open Sicilian, and I haven't talked about the absolute main line yet, the Najdorf. But in some ways I have, because the Najdorf has the potential to be all 3 of the families at once. I was going to make an inappropriate joke, but let's not do that. It's possible for black to play with g6, what's known as the Dragendorf. Doesn't have the best reputation compared to either the Dragon or the Najdorf property, but it's possible. And there are some lines, especially when white's very quiet, where black will put his bishop on e7, not his king, his bishop, and then later drop it back and bring it back here anyway. So there's it's always possible to put the bishop here. It's also possible, if white plays something like with the bishop c4 lines, where black will opt to play with e6, where he's going to get that small Scheveningen center. And it's also possible for black to play with e5, where he's going to get that Sveshnikov, Lowenthal, Kalashnikov, that e5 structure. And so one of the reasons why the Najdorf is such a popular opening is because it's so flexible. It has all this, but then that also gives it, in order to play the Najdorf well, you need to be able to do all of this, right? It's not as if you can just specialize in one little bit. You have to do everything. And this challenges both players, because you're challenging white. All right, in this position, does he have enough to take advantage of d5? Does white have that positional know-how in order to stop black's active play and to create the... and for him to justify having that positional advantage? Can he do enough with it to stop black from getting his activity increasing higher and higher? Is white prepared to do that? Right? Or you can play the slower e6. Is white prepared for a longer maneuvering game, where black is going to counterattack at the right moment? Or again at g6, is white prepared for black having the really active piece play, which they all complement each other, and potentially with the kingside attack? So I'm also going to not lie here, is that the Najdorf requires study, specialization. It's not something I can just speak off of, because for every rule or idea, and in fact almost all the ideas I just gave, there are concrete variations where they get completely blown out. And so it's just something you need to study. It's not something that you get from a free Smithy YouTube video. I'm sorry. But this is exactly why it is so interesting and popular, is for that reason. Because it's the closest to having all the Sicilians into one little package. And then there's also, I probably should mention that there's, for everything that I've said, which is as true as generalities go, there's also, I might as well just talk about White's one possible setup, which is known as the English attack, because White can do this against pretty much every Sicilian. It works much better against some than others, but White has, I'll just put it on the board. Let's just look at, let's at least pretend to do it properly. Where it's this structure, where White puts the pawn on f3 and e4, bishop on e3, queen on d2, castles, queenside, and then he just, arrows are tough. He just, imagine those are right arrows. He's going to throw his pawns, and he's just going to throw his pieces at the king. And again, White can do this against anything. This is the closest you've got to a universal White system against a Sicilian. Almost anything. White can do this against just about everything. And it's a very common plan. And this also means that if you ever want to play the Sicilian as black, which, for the record, I would not recommend until you're in the intermediate stage. So if you're below 1400 trying to play these positions as black, you're just asking to get not very fun. Believe me, I lived that. I started playing the Dragon when I was younger because it's the Dragon. There's a friggin' opening called the Dragon? Of course you're going to play the Dragon. And, I lost, 80% of my games because I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew it was called the Dragon. Not a good idea. But once you get to around the 1400 range, maybe you can play around with it. That'd be my advice, at least. Anyway, but if you are going to play the Sicilian as black, you need to be prepared for White just going absolutely gung-ho, castling and throwing his pawns at you. Pure caveman. Now, of course, Black's got the exact same thing he can do. He can throw his pawns at White. Again, his queen. You can imagine, the bishops and the knights. And it's not as if Black is completely defenseless, but you need to know what you're doing. So, as concise as I could make it, that is the Sicilian, with the various plans, various ideas. I tried to cover, even a couple typical. Actually, there's one thing I didn't even talk about. I guess there's no way I can talk about the Sicilian if I don't talk about the rook takes c3 sacrifice. Because then you don't know what I'm telling you, right? And so, perhaps this is just a made-up position. One of the most important thematic ideas that Black has. I talked about White potentially sacrificing on e6. White can sacrifice just about anywhere, in all honesty. Black's main counter shot is right here. Rook takes c3. So look what's happened. White's king is completely, pawn structure is now a mess. We can imagine the queen coming over, hitting some things. Other rook's going to slide over, hitting some things. We can imagine the knight maneuvering around, and it's going to, or the knight comes to e5, where it jumps over, and there's huge amounts of weaknesses. And so, again, I mentioned at the very, very beginning, I'm pretty sure I did, that there's that C file is where Black's counterplay tends to come from. This is the prime example. Very rarely is this a mistake. Considering Black is giving up the exchange, he almost always gets decent compensation. Maybe not enough, maybe, you are down material, but you get, practical chances. And often it's simply the right idea, and it gives White a heck of a lot of problems to solve, and it's the best move. And so that is Black's absolute main sacrifice across just about all the variations. That rook takes c3, whether White castles kingside, queenside, it has the potential of blowing up White's position. So I had to make sure I covered that. Rook takes c3. Can I put that on the board? Yeah. Rook takes c3. And if you were to look at any collection of Sicilian games, like famous games, you're going to see this sacrifice come up again and again and again. Anyway, For real this time, that is the general survey of the Open Sicilian. There's some ideas. Again, do not just look at this video and say, that looks fun, and then try and play Sicilian yourself. You're going to need to look at some other resources. There are tons of books, there are tons of videos, both free or paid. Find something and study it, right? Like, what is it, like 25% of master games nowadays or something like with this opening? Whatever it is. It's an extremely rich, interesting opening. I hope I did it justice. At the very least, this will give you some ideas when you're watching or reviewing future Sicilian games. You can see, hopefully, if I did my job well, how some of these ideas come about. Otherwise, that's enough rambling. Thanks for watching SmithyQ, SmithyQ.com. I will have the second part of this up shortly, where I'll talk about some of the anti-Sicilians and how they're quite different from this. But again, that'll be later this week. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.